Hi everyone, I'm Carl and I hope you're doing well. In this video, I'm going to talk about how I painted not one, not two, but 20 Chaos Beastmen from Battle Masters in one go. It was a terrible idea, but still. Battle Masters was a tabletop game set in Warhammer's old world and released by MB Games and Games Workshop in 1992. It was never as popular as its older sibling Heroquest, but it has a fond place in many fantasy wargamers' hearts. These beastmen look a bit weirder than the more recent sculpts, which have settled into a mostly goat-like appearance. The older sculpts, especially the ones from the 80s, have a lot of variety, which I think reflects the idea of chaos out better. Now, batch painting is something that wargamers should be familiar with, as they're used to having to paint whole regiments for their games. The number of miniatures is a bit higher than roleplayers would need. Let's put it this way. 20 beastmen in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay are a lot more than your adventuring band of ratcatchers, cobblers and law students can deal with at one go, and more like something you'd need to ask the friendly local artillery crew to help with. Even so, sometimes you might want to get a few goblins done up for your game, and you don't really need to get them up to competition quality. And that is one of the nice things about painting in this way. We generally expect all our work to be our best work ever. Obviously that's not possible by definition, but somehow we all expect that, subconsciously or otherwise. Painting batches kind of frees you up from that because it just doesn't allow you to obsess over details in the same way that painting a single piece does. It's not a license to be sloppy, but it can be very liberating to just paint without putting pressure on yourself, because you know that at the outset that you will still do your best, but none of these individual miniatures will be your best. And they don't need to be. That's my excuse anyway. This will not be an end-to-end paint tutorial, instead I will be focusing on some specific elements and the process in general. And since this video is going to be quite long, I will be leaving some timestamps in the description below. Before we get started on the paint job itself, let's take a minute to talk about two tools. None of these things are absolutely necessary, but they do make life a lot easier, and easier things are more likely to get finished. First, painting handles. They make handling the miniatures much easier, let you change angles and prevent you from touching your paintwork. I also find that my hands get a lot less tired using them, so I can work a bit longer per sitting. You can buy paint handles, but in my case I just slightly glued my miniatures to corks. Not pretty and not very fancy, but it works great. Second, a wet palette. Again, you can find commercial ones, but I just built mine out of a sealable container, 3 kitchen sponges and some baking paper. The job of a wet palette is to keep your paint hydrated so it doesn't dry on you as quickly while you work. This is critical if you want to mix your paints into a consistent color across several miniatures. Depending on your palette and the humidity in your work area, some paints can remain usable for days, as long as you seal the palette when you're done. I would like to build another one at some point. It would work better if it had more surface area and a shallower draft. However, this one is more than enough to see me through. Okay, that's enough raving about tools and time to get into the paint job. I started by sticking all the miniatures to a wooden board and spraying them. This let me spray them quickly in one go. Since I didn't film it before priming, I'm going to show you the process I did before I sealed them. I stuck a piece of painter's tape to my board, and then superglued another piece of tape with the tacky side facing up. To keep it all in one place, I also added more tape over the edges. This had enough grip to hold my miniatures while I took them outside to spray them. And I was also able to take them off, lock them and stick them back to the same piece of tape for a final layer of sealer. If this sounds like too much prep work for you, tune in next week. I have some ideas to make it much faster to set up, using science. In the meantime, maybe subscribe if you haven't already, and while you're there consider hitting the like button too. The real work starts when the miniatures are being primed. Now, a plan would be a really useful thing to have, and if I was a wise person, I would have painted one of these guys to completion, so I could get an idea of all the tricky spots, the colors I wanted to use, and so on. I am not a wise man, so I started patch painting right away. To do the skins, I started by painting all the shadow areas in green. I reasoned that these guys live in the deep forest, so greenish shadows make sense. Then I went over the rest of the skin with a mix of yellow ochre and red for the base color of the skin, and shaded everything with Seraphim Sepia. Once the shade dried, I started to add some highlights with a mixture of ivory and red. This is where I realized I had made my first mistake, as the highlights stood out far too brightly. To fix this, I washed over everything again to tone it down. If I had been painting a single miniature, this would not have been so much of a problem, but even simple steps have to be multiplied by 20 and take time. If I had skipped the first layer of wash, I would have saved myself quite a bit of time. Next, I started to add the highlight over all of the bodies, using the same mix of ivory and red. This time it looked okay, and I made the incredibly dumb decision of feathering the highlight. Again, this is something I normally do all the time when I paint miniatures, but here I was repeating it 20 times. That's why a plan is a nice thing to have. It was around this point that I gave up on getting this done quickly, and just decided to enjoy the process and use the time to think. Painting like this can be very zen. You only need to make decisions once, and after that you're just replicating the same choice over and over, which is quite relaxing. It's also really good for practicing techniques you're already comfortable with, as you can repeat the same thing over and over with no variables getting in the way. On the other hand, I wouldn't recommend using it to learn a new technique you haven't tried before, simply because you can't give one model your full undivided attention for more than a few seconds. I did all the highlights on the left legs, on all the models, and then all the right legs, and so on. I also had time to think about how I would use these guys in a story, especially about what makes them scary. In the role-playing game, these guys are not much tougher than orcs, but there's something much more threatening about them. Sure, they hide in the woods near your village and you never know when they're coming, but there's something creepier to them. Orcs are dangerous, but they're part of the natural order of things. Beastmen are creatures twisted and mutated by the power of chaos. If your players fight an orc horde, survivors can probably get away with a few broken bones and missing fingers. Beastmen on the other hand tend to hang around places with a lot of chaos energy, which could leave your players with mutations and a front place seat at a burning if witch hunters notice that. Depending on the chaos gods that the Beastmen follow, your players could even pick up some insanities, or maybe a plague. That town you saved last week? Wiped out by a mysterious disease, oh dear. Or if you like the changer of ways, maybe the herd was occupying the land around the tomb of an ancient chaos warrior. Clearing the herd allows the villagers to use the area. Years down the line they uncover the tomb and find some kind of artifact that turns some villagers to chaos worship. You can probably tell that this step took me a very long time to get through. Eventually the skins were done and I turned my attention to the faces. This was when my train of thought went off the rails and I thought they looked a lot like the evil cousins of Gordon Shumway from Alf, which would be pretty goofy. I had a look at the reference art and it didn't help much. There they look like the Bernstein Bears after they set up a meth lab and started working out. You know how a lot of 80s and 90s kids shows had at least one episode about drug abuse? This looked like it. and knowing how Citadel artists lapped up pop culture, this was potentially true. It didn't fit in with my idea of the evil in the woods though, so I decided to make them look rougher and gnarlier by stippling a texture on their faces. I'm sure you can spot the flaw in the plan already. All 20 faces. Seriously, make a plan before you start. It helps. Moving on. The leathers were a good change of pace and reasonably fast. I base coated these in burnt sienna, and then dabbed the larger areas with a sponge, with a mix of burnt sienna and yellow ochre. This isn't very visible right away, but once I washed it with a black wash, it produced some interesting textures. I also did some edge highlights by feathering in some yellow ochre. For the metal effect on the axis, I started off by base coating the axe head in dark grey, and the edge in a light grey. Once this was fully dry, I added in some white in the middle of the edges, and wet blended in some green and grey to create a little gradient. I waited for this to dry, then added some dark grey to the top and bottom of each edge and feathered it down. I left a little lighter colour underneath showing, but you could also cover it all the way and do an edge highlight later. On the axe head, I painted a black line up to the edge, then wet blended it with a darker grey on the rest of the head. This created a clear definition where the blade starts, lightening up towards the shaft. I then touched up the edges and added some lighter greys to the piece, holding the head to the shaft as well as the bolts. I left the edges of the base for last, and man was it satisfying to clean them up. All I needed to do at this point was seal the miniatures, flock the bases, and because I have no intention of ever painting this lot again, give them another thick coat of sealer. I hope you enjoyed this video. Even if I grumbled a lot while painting, the process was certainly relaxing once I gave up trying to be fast. Though I think I could have cut down the time considerably if I had made a better plan at the beginning. Let me know in the comments below if you can think of any time-saving ideas apart from making less mistakes. In the meantime, thank you for watching, stay safe and have a great week.